A civilization that spans 1,000,000 worlds and can destroy an entire planet on command, loads its ship guns by human hand. Hundreds of laborers per cannon, sweating, bleeding, sometimes crushed under munitions the size of buildings. Gangs of press-ganged workers hauling shells along rails in conditions a powder monkey on a Napoleonic warship would recognize. Except these shells weigh tons, and the heat from repeated firing cooks the air until men collapse where they stand. The Imperium of Man fields warships kilometers long, bristling with macro cannon batteries the size of city blocks, carrying populations equivalent to small cities in their bellies. And the loading mechanism for those world-breaking guns is human muscle. If you understand why, you understand everything about the darkest setting ever created. Every mainstream Warhammer 40K overview will tell you the Imperium is humanity's last hope. For the billions of servitors, hive-world laborers, and Imperial Guardsmen ground up inside its machinery, the Imperium is the nightmare, not the solution to it. The answer to why handload is precise and lore-consistent. The Imperium's governing theology, its institutional memory, and its entire economic model treats human bodies as more expendable than circuitry. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperium's priesthood of technology, regards unsanctioned innovation as literal heresy against their machine god. A galaxy-wide prohibition on artificial intelligence stems from a trauma so ancient no one alive remembers the actual event: the rebellion of the Men of Iron, a machine uprising during the dark age of technology so catastrophic that its specifics have been lost. The lesson the Imperium drew from that catastrophe wasn't build better safeguards. It was replace silicon with flesh. Human nervous systems can't rebel against their programming if you remove enough of the brain first. Human muscle doesn't require software updates, and human bodies, drawn from a population numbering in the trillions, cost functionally nothing to replace. That single pivot from machine labor to human slavery, codified across 10,000 years of religious doctrine, is the skeleton key. Everything downstream flows from a civilization that decided human bodies were cheaper, more disposable, and more theologically palatable than circuits. Academic analyses of the setting confirm what the fiction broadcasts openly. The lore makes no attempt to hide the miseries of life within the Imperium, and working conditions on most planets approach slavery within its bureaucratic militarist apparatus. So forget the grand chronological timeline. Forget the faction catalog and Space Marine chapter breakdown. What follows is an escalation. Each stage compounds the last. The parenthetical in the title, "and it gets worse," is a structural promise. It will be kept. Imagine being told the Imperium punishes criminals by lobotomizing them, scraping away personality, memory, the capacity for independent thought, grafting cybernetic augmentations onto the emptied body, creating a servitor, a biological machine that performs menial, dangerous, or degrading labor across every Imperial institution. Servitors load ammunition on those warship gun decks. They transcribe documents. They operate cranes in manufactorum foundries. They stand in corridors as living furniture, slack faces occasionally twitching with some ghost of a prior self. One person, encountering this concept for the first time, said a single sentence about servitors killed all my interest in AdMech, the faction that creates them, and then admitted they couldn't stop reading. A more lore-literate correction pushed back on the common assumption. Servitors, they pointed out, are almost always vat-grown and genetically engineered, rather than merely lobotomized criminals. The instinctive response is relief. They were never conscious. They were never people. The horror recedes for exactly 1 second before the full weight of that correction lands. The Imperium has industrialized the production of human bodies specifically designed for enslavement. Criminal lobotomy implies punishment, cruelty applied retroactively to someone who existed first. Vat growing implies manufacturing, an engineered supply chain. Human nervous systems, human muscle tissue, human organs, all cultured from genetic material in biological vats, shaped from inception to serve as components in a living machine. The Imperium didn't stumble into this practice through wartime desperation. It built an entire logistics pipeline for growing disposable people, and that pipeline runs at civilizational scale across 1,000,000 worlds. The variety of servitor types reveals the scope. Gun-servitors with ballistic weapons fused to their arms lurch into battle alongside Mechanicus Scutari cohorts. The Imperial Navy stuffs them into warship roles, too dangerous or tedious for even press-ganged human laborers. And then there are the cherubim, constructed from infant-sized bodies, whether vat-grown or otherwise, fitted with anti-gravity devices and crude mechanical wings. They flutter around ecclesiarchy cathedrals carrying incense and holy texts. A grotesque parody of angels rendered in dead infant flesh wrapped around mechanical innards, their infantile faces frozen in permanent rictus. The Imperium's relationship with Christian iconography and messaging takes on a different character entirely when you realize the angels are made of dead children. Archoflagellants push the logic further still. Typically condemned heretics or criminals sentenced by the ecclesiarchy, they undergo extensive surgical and chemical modification. Arms replaced with flails, shock whips, or electroscourges. Combat stimulants held in check by pacifier helms that maintain a near comatose state until a trigger phrase sends them into berserk violence, flailing, screaming, destroying everything within reach until they're spent or killed. Inquisitor Karamazov, one of the most notoriously zealous members of the Ordo Hereticus, travels with entire retinues of archoflagellants, each one a former human being reduced to a biological cruise missile wearing a hood. The theological justification frames this as penance through suffering in the Emperor's name. The practical result is a human dissident transformed into a biological cruise missile wearing a hood. Cruelty implies intent, and the Imperium is frequently too vast and too bureaucratically calcified to possess coherent intent. What it possesses instead is a singular, devastating efficiency in converting human bodies into expendable resources. The Mechanicus can barely maintain the technology it inherited from a more enlightened age. Innovation has atrophied. Reform is heretical. But the machinery for taking a human being and rendering them into a component runs flawlessly. Blessed by the Omnissiah, sanctified by 10 millennia of doctrine. The servitor represents the purest expression of this principle. Everything that follows, hive worlds, the Imperial Guard, the gravitational pull of chaos, operates on the same foundation at different scales. If the servitor is what the Imperium does to individual human bodies, the hive world is what it does to entire populations. A hive world is a planet so thoroughly urbanized that its surface is covered, sometimes entirely, by layered megacities called hive cities, each one a vertical sprawl stretching from kilometers below ground to spires piercing the upper atmosphere. A single hive city houses billions. Some worlds host multiple hive cities. Altitude determines quality of life with absolute literalness. Upper spires house imperial nobility and spacious luxury, perhaps 1% of the population. Mid-hive warrens contain manufactorums running around the clock, staffed by workers grinding through shifts that reach 20 hours. Below that, in the underhive, human existence degrades past anything recognizable as civilization. Lightless, lawless, choked with toxic runoff from the levels above, governed by armed gangs and mutant clans, populated by people who have never once seen the sky. Someone reaching for the most effective comparison available put it this way: a hive world is about as sanitary, crowded, and has as much social mobility as a Skaven undercity. For those unfamiliar with Warhammer Fantasy, the Skaven are literal rat people living in filth-choked warrens beneath human cities, a vermin civilization defined by cruelty, overpopulation, and the total disposability of every individual life. That comparison devastates because it's structurally accurate rather than hyperbolic. Skaven society functions because an individual Skaven holds zero value. There are always more. Hive world society runs on the identical calculus. The proletarian class exists within an economic structure where labor conditions approach slavery, and the bureaucratic militarist apparatus extracts value from populations rather than sustaining them. Necromunda, perhaps the most famous hive world in the setting, has an entire tabletop game, Necromunda Underhive, depicting the gang warfare, factional violence, and desperate survival that constitute daily life in the lower levels. A setting where the most aspirational outcome available to a human being is becoming a slightly more successful gang member. The food supply tells the story with brutal efficiency. Upper spire nobility eats imported delicacies from agri-worlds. Mid-hive workers subsist on protein paste manufactured from processed biological matter. In the underhive and lower levels, that biological matter includes recycled human remains, a substance referred to in the fiction as corpse starch. In a hive city of billions, the dead enter the recycling system rather than the ground. A resident consuming their daily ration bar is, with high probability, eating the processed remains of their neighbors. The system has been so thoroughly normalized that the question of knowledge or consent barely registers. Born in your tier, you work in your tier, you die in your tier, and your body feeds whoever replaces you. Social mobility effectively doesn't exist. And above all of this, the Imperium's tithe system reinforces the cage from outside. Every imperial world owes a tithe to Terra, paid in materials, manufactured goods, and human bodies. Hive worlds export people in bulk: laborers, colonists, soldiers. Tithe compliance is absolute. Failure invites investigation by imperial authorities. An investigation tends to conclude with planetary leadership replaced, imprisoned, or publicly executed as a cautionary sermon to neighboring systems. The Imperial Guard, the Astra Militarum, is where this pipeline terminates, where systemic abstraction becomes personal slaughter. The Guard constitutes the Imperium's primary military force, composed almost entirely of ordinary human beings drawn from the planetary tithe. Hive world factory workers, agri-world farmhands, feral world tribespeople. Conscripted issued a lasgun, a weapon whose inadequacy against the Imperium's major threats has become a grim running joke within the community. Given training ranging from rigorous to perfunctory, loaded onto troop transports, and shipped to whatever war zone currently requires bodies. Someone captured this dynamic perfectly. The Guard is like throwing a rock at a nuclear bomb, and brother, do we have a lot of rocks. Deployment conditions compound the expendability. Transport aboard Imperial troop ships is cramped, unsanitary, and often lethal before a guardsman reaches combat. Warp travel is inherently hazardous, shipboard conditions are medieval, and disease outbreaks among densely packed regiments claim lives that never see a battlefield. Upon arrival, guardsmen face enemies that outclass them along virtually every physical axis. Orcs are stronger and more numerous. Tyranids constitute an endless swarm of alien predators. Chaos Space Marines are former superhuman warriors enhanced further by demonic corruption. Imperial doctrine accounts for this mismatch with arithmetic rather than innovation. Thousands of lasguns firing in concert can bring down a Chaos Space Marine. Millions of guardsmen hurled into a meat grinder engagement can exhaust a Tyranid tendril. The math resolves. It always resolves. It merely requires an inexhaustible supply of human beings willing, or compelled at gunpoint, to die. That gunpoint comes from commissars, political officers attached to guard regiments with authority to summarily execute any soldier displaying cowardice, insubordination, or hesitation. A bolt pistol, firing self-propelled explosive rounds, discharged into the skull of a wavering guardsman in full view of the unit. The enemy ahead might kill you. The commissar behind you certainly will if you turn around. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick earned his legend at the Second and Third Wars for Armageddon through charisma rather than exclusively terror, which is precisely what makes him exceptional. The typical commissar operates on a simpler protocol. The Siege of Rocks illustrates the resulting scale. A 17-year campaign to recapture a single fortress world from Chaos Renegades, consuming millions of Imperial Guard lives in trench warfare, complete with chemical weapons, artillery barrages, and infantry charges across corpse-choked no man's land. The Imperium won. The cost equaled entire planetary populations of dead guardsmen. Imperial strategic calculus logged this as acceptable. The emotional through-line snaps into focus across these compounding layers. A hive-world resident is born into a stratified cage, fed recycled dead, worked for 20 hours, offered zero possibility of advancement, then conscripted and shipped to a war zone where life expectancy is measured in minutes of contact. Every stage extracts maximum utility from the human body and discards the remainder. Which brings the uncomfortable question the Imperium doesn't want asked. Why would anyone choose chaos? Standard 40K narratives frame chaos worship as villainy, power-hungry sorcerers, deluded fanatics, the cosmically corrupted. Mainstream explainers treat the four chaos gods as external threats that justify the Imperium's internal brutality. But hold the evidence assembled so far against the question of what drives a hive worker, a guardsman, a broken human being to kneel before powers the Imperium has spent 10,000 years telling them to fear. The answer isn't insanity, it's arithmetic. Each chaos god feeds on specific emotions generated at industrial scale by imperial oppression itself. Corn feeds on rage and violence, produced in bottomless quantities by the Imperium's endless wars. Nurgle feeds on despair and the bone-deep resignation of lives without hope, the psychological baseline of every underhive resident consuming corpse starch in the dark. Tzeentch feeds on ambition and the desperate hunger for escape, emotions that burn white-hot in populations with zero social mobility. Slaanesh feeds on excess and sensation-seeking, hedonism as escape from the grinding numbness of a 20-hour factory shift where you'll never be anything other than what you were born. A correction sharpens this further. Many casual fans cling to the belief that Khorne possesses a code of martial honor. He doesn't. Khorne doesn't care whether the blood is shed in single combat or in a massacre of civilians. Blood is blood. Another common framing casts Nurgle as a loving grandfather figure who genuinely cares for his diseased followers, welcoming them into his garden. He doesn't. Nurgle's love is the relationship of a parasite to a host body. Stripping away these comforting misconceptions removes the last cope that at least some path through chaos retains dignity. None of them do. They're all parasitic. And they all feed on misery the Imperium mass produces as a byproduct of its own existence. From the perspective of a hive worker who has never seen sunlight, who eats processed human remains, who will work until they die and be recycled into someone else's lunch, the Imperium's God Emperor demands suffering now in exchange for nothing. Chaos, at minimum, promises something: power, meaning, community, escape. An end to the pain, even if that end is transformation into something no longer recognizably human. Gene-stealer cults, alien-infiltrated organizations offering family and belonging to hive-world outcasts, thrive in these same conditions for identical reasons. When your civilization gives you nothing, anything that offers something wins. Someone asked a question that cuts to the bone of this dynamic. What did lust feed before Slaanesh was born? The answer reveals the chaos gods as parasites feeding on fundamental human emotions, not exotic evil energies, but rage, despair, ambition, desire. Emotions every human being has felt. The Imperium's own oppression generates the psychic misery that feeds chaos, creating a self-sustaining loop. The official propaganda says brutality is necessary because chaos exists. The structural truth runs closer to the reverse. Chaos thrives because the Imperium is brutal. The cure feeds the disease. The disease justifies the cure. And in the gap between those two lies the defining tragedy of the setting. Black ships trawl every world in the Imperium, collecting psychers, humans born with psychic abilities. The most powerful and disciplined may be trained as sanctioned psychers, serving the military or the Inquisition. The rest, thousands every single day, are fed into the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows Imperial ships to navigate the warp. The Imperium's own navigation system runs on human sacrifice. And when contamination is suspected, chaos corruption, gene stealer infiltration, or even mass rebellion against Imperial authority, the Inquisition holds the authority to order exterminatus, the complete destruction of an Imperial planet's biosphere. Billions of people, the overwhelming majority of whom committed no heresy, annihilated in hours. Guilty of nothing beyond living on a world the Inquisition judged unsalvageable. The Imperium routinely destroys more of its own people than many external threats manage. Return now to those warship gun decks. Hundreds of laborers per cannon, hauling building-sized shells by hand while the air cooks around them. You understand the servitor forges that produce the biological machines standing alongside those laborers. You understand the hive worlds those laborers were born in, the corpse starch they ate, the 20-hour shifts that prepared their bodies for this next form of extraction. You understand the commissar standing behind them with a bolt pistol. You understand that if any of them break, mentally, physically, spiritually, the chaos gods are waiting with open arms and empty promises, feeding on the very despair the Imperium created. In a civilization where human life is the cheapest commodity available, building a machine to do a human's job isn't just unnecessary. It's theologically offensive. Why automate when you can conscript? Why innovate when you can breed servitors in vats? Why reform when reform itself is heresy? The Imperium doesn't protect humanity. It consumes humanity. And the darkest thing about the darkest setting ever created isn't the monsters outside the walls. It's the slow realization that the walls are made of people, and the Imperium has spent 10,000 years making sure no one inside can imagine them being made of anything else. Subscribe for more stories like this.